In the year 1883, the forests of New Mexico stretched endlessly, wild and untamed, a land where survival belonged only to the strong and the cunning. Ethan Crowley knew this truth better than most. A seasoned hunter with sun-weathered skin and a beard the color of storm clouds, he had lived off the land since boyhood. At dawn, he left his small log cabin with steel traps slung over his shoulder and his Winchester rifle resting against his back. Hunting was not just his trade, it was his way of staying alive in a world that gave nothing freely. The morning air carried the bite of pine and dust, and Ethan moved silently through the towering pines, setting his traps along game trails he had memorized over years. He expected the usual coyotes, bobcats, maybe a wolf if luck favored him. Furs meant food, bullets, and firewood for the winter. By afternoon, his work was done, and he made his way homeward, content that the forest would yield him the survival he needed. Yet, even then, the forest carried an unease he couldn't quite name. By sunset, he returned to check the traps, rifle ready at his side. The woods were too quiet, unnaturally so, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. No rustling of small game, no familiar call of birds, only silence heavy as stone. Ethan's instincts sharpened. Something wasn't right. Then, breaking through the hush of twilight, came a sound that froze him in his tracks. It wasn't the cry of a fox or the snarl of a wolf. It was a human scream, sharp, pained, and desperate. His boots pounded against the earth as he followed the sound, heart thudding in his chest like a war drum. He pushed through branches until the trap came into sight. What he saw stopped him cold. Caught in the steel jaws was not the mangled body of a beast, but the figure of a young woman. Her long black hair was tangled with leaves, her leg caught in the trap's cruel bite, blood staining the ground beneath her. Her eyes lifted to him, dark and blazing with fury even through the pain. Ethan's breath caught. She wasn't just any woman, she was Apache. A people who knew these woods far better than he ever could, and a people who had little love for men like him. He cursed under his breath, realizing the weight of the moment. To the tribe, this was no accident. If they found her here, trapped by his hand, they'd brand him an enemy, a murderer. His rifle felt suddenly useless, his traps foolish. He had set out for fur and coin, but snared something that could cost him his very life. The woman struggled, her hands clawing at the steel, her face twisted with both agony and defiance. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low, careful, like one might speak to a wild animal. "Hold still," he said. "You'll tear yourself apart." She glared up at him, her breath ragged. "Don't touch me," she hissed, her words sharp as arrows. But Ethan saw the blood soaking through her torn dress, saw the way her strength faltered with each pull. She was strong, but she wouldn't last long without help. Kneeling, Ethan placed his rifle aside and reached for the trap. "You'll lose your leg if I don't free you," he muttered. His hands pressed the iron springs until the jaws released their cruel grip. The woman cried out, collapsing onto the earth, clutching her wounded leg. Ethan sat back, sweat dripping from his brow. He had expected relief, maybe gratitude, but her eyes still blazed with fire. She didn't see him as a savior. She saw him as another enemy, another hunter in a world that hunted her people. For a moment, silence wrapped around them again, broken only by her strained breathing. Ethan tore a strip from his shirt, pressing it firmly against her wound to slow the bleeding. She tried to push him away, weak but stubborn. "Better to die than owe you," she whispered bitterly. Ethan ignored her words, tightening the makeshift bandage with a hunter's precision. He wasn't sure why he cared. Maybe guilt, maybe some deeper pull he couldn't name. All he knew was he couldn't leave her here, not like this, not bleeding alone in the wilderness. The woman's gaze studied him as if searching for deceit. Her voice softened, though the edge remained. "Why help me?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer at first, his eyes focused on tying the bandage. At last he spoke low and steady. "Because it's the right thing to do." The word surprised even him. In a land where every man fought for himself, the right thing was a luxury few could afford. But looking at her, he knew he couldn't walk away. Something about the fire in her eyes had already bound him. She leaned back against the pine needles, exhausted yet unbroken. "You saved me," she said finally. "That means my life is tied to yours, until my people decide otherwise." The weight of her words sank into Ethan like stone. He hadn't just freed her leg. He had stepped into something far larger, something dangerous. The forest around them seemed to lean in, listening, as though it knew their fates had just intertwined. Ethan glanced at the horizon. The sun had dipped below the treeline, and shadows swallowed the forest whole. Ethan rose slowly, offering his hand. She hesitated, then allowed him to help her to her feet. Her weight was light, yet the trust she gave was heavier than anything he had ever carried. He supported her as they began the slow walk away from the trap, his rifle slung across his back, his eyes darting through the trees. He knew the Apache were close. He could feel it in the silence, in the unseen eyes that might already be watching. Each step forward felt like a step into unknown danger. The night deepened, stars pricking the sky like silver pins. Ethan built a small fire in a clearing, its smoke curling into the dark. The woman sat quietly, her face lit by the flames, her expression unreadable. He didn't ask her name, and she didn't offer it. Some things in the wilderness took time, and trust was one of them. Still, he could not shake the thought that his life had shifted forever. He had set a trap for prey and instead ensnared destiny itself. Ethan's first instinct had been fear, a deep primal fear that ran colder than any wolf's howl in the night. If the Apache found their young woman in his trap, his life would be measured in minutes, not hours. Yet as his eyes fell on the blood running thick down her leg, guilt struck him harder than fear ever could. He had never meant for this, never intended for a trap meant for beasts to catch a human heart. And still, here she was bleeding fierce, unbroken, caught because of his hand. His fingers worked the steel jaws until they gave way, freeing her with a final snap. She collapsed onto the forest floor, her breath ragged, but her eyes never leaving his face. There was no gratitude in them, only suspicion and fire. "Why help me?" she asked, her voice weak but edged with steel. Ethan didn't answer right away. Words were useless against the storm of distrust between them. Instead, he tore a strip from his shirt, rough fabric ripping under his calloused hands. He pressed it against her wound, ignoring the way she winced and tried to push him away. "Hold still," he muttered. She resisted, then gave in, though her glare remained sharp as a blade. His hands bound the cloth tight around her leg, slowing the bleeding. When he looked up, her expression had shifted, not soft, not trusting, but puzzled, as though she couldn't decide what manner of man stood before her. Finally, she spoke again, quieter this time. "You saved me. That means my life is tied to yours." Ethan froze, her words sinking deeper than he cared to admit. In Apache tradition, those who save another bound themselves in spirit. Whether she meant it as a vow or a warning, he couldn't yet tell. But the weight of it settled heavy on his shoulders. He had thought himself free as the wilderness. Now he realized freedom had been replaced with a bond he couldn't break. The forest deepened in shadow, the pines stretching tall like silent witnesses. Ethan leaned back, running a hand over his beard, uncertain what to say. The sun had slipped beyond the ridge, leaving them in the blue-gray gloom of twilight. He should leave her here, he thought. Walk away, return to his cabin, and forget. But each time the idea crossed his mind, the sight of her leg bleeding against the dirt burned in his memory. Leaving her was impossible now, though staying carried danger of its own. She shifted against the ground, her face tight with pain. Ethan caught the smallest tremor of her hands as she tried to stand and failed. Without thinking, he moved to help her up, offering his arm. She hesitated, her pride and mistrust fighting against her weakness, then finally accepted. Her weight was slight, her frame lean from years of survival, but every step she leaned on him felt heavy with unspoken tension. Together, they began a slow walk through the darkening woods, neither speaking, both lost in thought. The night grew colder, stars prickling into existence one by one. Ethan stopped at a small clearing, striking flint to build a modest fire.